So, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms just wrapped up, and even though we walked away from a pretty tragic death, it felt like things mostly worked out in the end, right? But what if I told you there's a character with the absolute saddest arc in the entire series? One most of us barely even noticed? I'm talking about Maekar Targaryen, a character who initially came off as a complete asshole, but ended up being the most interesting one in terms of growth throughout the story. A lot of people didn't even pay attention to his character, and by the end, even the director seemed to treat him mostly as comic relief. A choice I completely disagree with, but we'll talk more about that later. So why am I saying that Maekar has the saddest character arc in the whole series? The short answer is this. He killed his brother, his two eldest sons turned out to be a complete disappointment, and his youngest, the only one he truly had hopes for, ran off with a hedge knight, directly disobeying him. As you can see, things weren't looking very good for him from the start. We're first introduced to Maekar in Episode 2 when Dunk sneaks into the royal chamber. Maekar is the first to notice him, and he immediately goes on the offensive, calling Dunk a spy and demanding answers. When we compare this attitude to that of his brother, Baelor Targaryen, it's clear that the writers wanted us to dislike Maekar while empathizing with Baelor. But this scene has a much deeper meaning than what we see on the surface. To truly understand the weight of this moment, we need some background on the two brothers. They were sons of Daeron II Targaryen, a king who managed to undo much of the damage his father had caused to the realm. Daeron was a visionary who unified Westeros by marrying Mireia Martell, finally bringing Dorne into the fold. However, his reign was far from peaceful, as he spent years locked in a brutal power struggle with his rebellious half-brother, Daemon Blackfyre. I've actually made a separate video diving deeper into the Blackfyre Rebellion, which I'll link in the description. Within Daeron's own family, there was a clear imbalance. Baelor was the firstborn, the golden heir, the charismatic leader, the man everyone expected to become a legendary king. Maekar, on the other hand, was the youngest. While Baelor was praised and prepared for greatness, Maekar was largely overlooked and pushed aside. Although Maekar didn't hate his brother, he was definitely a little jealous of him, and that jealousy likely haunted him later, making him question whether the killing blow he dealt to Baelor was truly an accident. It would have been fascinating to explore this inner conflict once Maekar eventually became king, but I'll come back to that near the end of the video. Maekar spent his entire life living in Baelor's shadow, and we can see hints of this in their very first scene together. When Dunk begins explaining why he's there, Maekar immediately asks what's going on, only for Baelor to stop him, saying that they were the intruders, and then calmly listen to Dunk. Maekar then quietly sits down at the table. The next time he speaks, he questions how Baelor could possibly remember a lowly hedge knight who unhorsed Daemon Lannister 16 years earlier. Baelor replies that he makes it a habit to learn everything he can about his foes. What makes this scene even more interesting is a subtle payoff revealed in the final episode. When Maekar asks Dunk to serve as his knight, he tells him, "Sir Arlen did what he could for you, I have no doubt, but you still have so much to learn." There's a clear difference between Maekar in Episode 2 and Maekar in Episode 6. His brother's death deeply affected him and reshaped the way he thinks. Early on, Maekar couldn't understand why Baelor would remember a mere hedge knight. Later, he openly acknowledges Sir Arlan of Pennytree, a clear sign of Baelor's lasting influence. I really like this change from the book. In the series, Maekar feels far more human. Despite what many people think, he wasn't the outright prick everyone assumed he was at the beginning. We also need to remember that when Dunk broke into the chamber, Maekar's sons were missing, and rumors claimed they were already dead. If I had to define Maekar by a single trait, it would be his love for his sons, even when he knew they were in the wrong. Given that context, it makes perfect sense that he would immediately assume Dunk was a spy or someone with dangerous intentions. The next part of Maekar's tragic arc is how his two eldest sons completely disappoint him. Daeron Targaryen, his firstborn and the one Maekar hoped would carry on his legacy, turns out to be a coward and a drunk, someone who prefers to run and hide rather than obey his father's wishes and take part in the tourney. And if that wasn't bad enough, his second son turns out to be outright evil, someone who abuses his Targaryen power at every opportunity. Maekar knows that Aerion Targaryen is in the wrong, yet he still chooses to stand by him. The disappointment, however, is clearly there. We see this most clearly in the scene where Dunk asks for a trial by combat. When Aerion demands a trial of 7, Maekar snaps at him. Are you cowering behind some 6,000-year-old foolery because you're afraid to face this hedge knight alone? Why not slay him yourself? Maekar's disappointment is visible not only in his facial expression, but also in his tone and choice of words. Just imagine it. Your son, who received the best education and combat training possible, is afraid to face a single hedge knight who isn't even allowed to enter a tourney. Worse still, Aerion is willing to risk the lives of 6 other men simply because he refuses to face the consequences of his own actions. That is the moment Maekar realizes he truly failed as a father, that he played a part in shaping Aerion into the man he became. And yet, despite this realization, he still chooses to stand by his son. I don't know about you, but the trial scene completely broke me, especially the moment when Maekar screams, "My boy," as he believes Dunk is about to kill Aerion. Maekar knows his son is wrong. He knows Aerion is a monster. But he is still his son, and no matter what Aerion has done, Maekar cannot cast that love aside. The scene ends with Maekar grabbing Aerion by the collar and dragging him out of the room. I have no doubt that the two of them had a far more heated argument off-screen. As if disappointment in his sons wasn't enough, Maekar is then betrayed by his brother, the one he admired the most, and without meaning to, he commits the gravest sin in Westeros, killing his own kin. Here we have it, a broken man, disappointed by his sons, who has now killed his own brother. His turning point in the final episode is deeply affecting. Up until then, Maekar had been harsh and emotionally closed off, but with just a few lines, we see a man who realizes he has lost everything in an instant, and will have to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. It feels painfully believable. He tells Dunk that he is sending Aerion to the Free Cities in the hope that it might change him for the better. This is essentially Maekar admitting that he failed as a father. That part of Aerion's cruelty is his fault. It's also his way of apologizing to Dunk for what he put him through. Then he says that it was his mace that killed his brother, and that some will claim he wanted Baelor dead. The gods know it is a lie, he says, but I will hear the whispers until the day I die. This line is incredibly important. Even if Maekar doesn't fully realize it yet, he knows that once his brothers take the throne, every future failure will be blamed on him. People will say, Baelor would never have made that mistake. Maekar will never escape this stigma, the man who killed the realm's golden boy. And this burden will only grow heavier once he eventually becomes king, as the whispers grow louder and more frequent. Another crucial scene that highlights Maekar's tragic story is when Egg tries to kill Aerion. That moment is pure sadness for Maekar. He isn't angry at Egg. He's devastated that things have come to this. He doesn't shout or lash out. Instead, he simply wraps his arms around him. That gesture says more than words ever could. It's Maekar silently apologizing for neglecting him, for turning a blind eye to his suffering, for not noticing the pain that drove Egg to such desperation. When Maekar closes his eyes at the end of the scene, it's the moment he truly understands his failures and resolves to do better. Maekar knows that his last hope lies with Egg. That's why he asked Dunk to accompany him to Summerhall and take Egg on as his squire. This version of Maekar feels far more human. No longer bitter, no longer defensive, but fully aware of his mistakes and determined to learn from his brother's example of chivalry in order to protect his last son. The Maekar we meet in Episode 2 would never have even looked at Dunk, let alone trusted him with his child. What makes this decision so powerful is that Maekar reaches it on his own. He recognizes that his older sons were raised in a toxic environment and turned out poorly. Instead of repeating the same mistakes, he makes a painful, loving sacrifice, letting Egg go so that he might grow into a better man, even if that means losing him. Sadly, much of this character growth is undermined in the final 5 minutes of the show, where it's implied that Maekar never actually allowed Egg to follow Dunk. In the novellas, however, it's strongly implied that Maekar eventually agrees. He even gives Egg his ring as proof of his Targaryen identity, in case they ever need to flee. This detail is extremely important, because in the next book, Egg is forced to reveal who he truly is, and without that ring, there's no way to prove it. I'm very curious how the show plans to address this issue going forward, because, as it stands, the ending makes it seem like Egg simply disobeyed his father once again. Maekar's story isn't about power or ambition, it's about regret. Regret for the sons he couldn't save, the brother he lost, and the mistakes he'll carry for the rest of his life. In a world of dragons and legends, his arc stands out because it feels painfully real.